Hi, I'm Susanna and this is my Jane Austen July wrap-up. Let's start with the Jane Austen novel I read for this year's Jane Austen July. That's Jane Austen's third novel, Mansfield Park. I read and annotated this Penguin Popular Classics edition, and I read the introduction and the notes from this Penguin Clothbound edition. This review will be a rather spoilery one, so if you haven't read Mansfield Park or any of Jane Austen's other novels, you might want to skip this. 10-year-old Fanny Price is sent to live with her rich relatives at Mansfield Park. Growing up with her cousins, she is constantly aware how precarious her place in society is. When a dashing couple from London, Henry and Mary Crawford, enter this rural world, they manage to dazzle everyone except Fanny, who sees through their superficial glamour. Mansfield Park is actually the first Jane Austen novel I've ever read. That was back when I was in high school. I was 16 years old, and this started my love for Jane Austen. Later on, Pride and Prejudice and Persuasion would take their places as my two favorite Jane Austen novels, but Mansfield Park still holds the third place. Mansfield Park is probably the Jane Austen novel that gets the most mixed reviews. Based on her letters, Jane Austen herself was aware that Mansfield Park wasn't going to be as entertaining as her previous novels. Part of the reason might be that Fanny Price is an unusual heroine. She is a shy, introverted, chronically ill, parentified oldest daughter of a negligent mother and an alcoholic father. She doesn't have the wit and vivacity of Elizabeth Bennet and Emma Woodhouse. But as an introvert myself, I have a soft spot for Fanny and I find her struggles relatable. Mansfield Park isn't a romance novel, and it isn't really a novel about Fanny either. It is the story of Mansfield Park and how one family is nearly ruined by selfish pursuit of wealth, status, and hedonistic pleasure. Sir Thomas Bertram leaves his family to take care of family business in Antigua. His indolent wife is incapable of taking care of the family while he is gone. The task falls to the hands of his officious sister-in-law, Mrs. Norris, whose sole goal is to save money and to make sure that Fanny Price does not think too highly of herself. His son Tom and his daughters Maria and Julia only care for pleasure. And Maria's choice of husband is purely dictated by motives of wealth and status. Even the otherwise sensible second son Edmund falters when two rich Londoners come to the village. The only constant in this story is Fanny, who observes everything that happens and draws her own conclusions. Mansfield Park shouldn't be read as a romance, at least not unless you want to be heavily disappointed. It is the least romantic of Austen's novels and should rather be read as social commentary on the selfishness of rich people. The romance between Fanny and Edmund is rather lackluster. I do agree that Fanny deserved better than either Edmund or Henry, but at least in the end she gets what she always wanted. One of the reasons why the romance fails might be due to the pacing of the book. This is the one Jane Austen book where I felt the middle could have been shorter. And as with so many other Jane Austen novels, the ending could have been correspondingly longer. Now Edmund's change of heart happens only in the last chapter. If the ending was less rushed, the romance might work better. But in any case, I think Edmund makes a better partner for Fanny than Henry Crawford ever could. Fanny would never have been able to trust that Henry had truly changed. And Mary Crawford herself thinks that Henry would have continued to flirt with Maria Rushford even after his marriage. Henry is simply too morally depraved, unlike Mr. Darcy or Captain Wentworth, whose faults are never in their morals. I, for one, will always applaud Jane Austen for saying resolute no to the reformed rake nonsense. Now, if you love Jane Austen and don't expect this book to be a romance, I'm sure you'll find much to love in Mansfield Park. I give this, like every other Jane Austen novel, 5 stars. For a Jane Austen work that is not one of her 6 main novels, I picked Sanditon. Sanditon is Jane Austen's unfinished novel and the last work she wrote. She started the manuscript in January 1817 before her death same year in July. The fragment includes first 12 chapters and thus barely more than introduce the main characters. Mr. Parker, an industrious rich man, is determined to make his seaside village of Sanditon a fashionable bathing place. After his carriage is overturned, he invites the daughter of the gentleman who helps him to join him and his wife to experience the pleasures of the place. The main character, Charlotte Haywood, is a practical and sensible 22-year-old woman. Unfortunately, we learn very little about her for her to make much of an impression. She mostly sees and experiences what other people say and do. Presumably, she would have ended up marrying Mr. Parker's younger brother Sidney, but as Sidney only appears in chapter 12, we never see them interacting with each other. Sir Edward, a wannabe rake, makes an interesting character as well. And it would have been fascinating to see what Jane Austen would have done with the rest of the hypochondriac set of characters. An unfinished novel by Jane Austen must always be a little disappointing. Not because of the writing or the story, but because we will never know what could have been. I wouldn't necessarily recommend Sanditon to a casual reader, but it's a must-read for every Jane Austen fan. I gave it 5 stars. My pick for a non-fiction read this month was What Jane Austen Ate and Charles Dickens Knew, From Fox Hunting to Whist, The Facts of Daily Life in 19th Century England by Daniel Boole. This is a companion to 19th century British novels. The book is divided in 2 sections. The first contains an introduction to life in 19th century England, giving basic information of things like currency, basic etiquette, card games and dinner parties, transport and home life. Part 2 is a glossary of terms a reader of 19th century English literature might need to know. This book is dense with information and at points a rather slow read. But it isn't really intended to be a non-fiction book you devour. It's more a handbook you consult while reading a classic novel and coming across something you want to learn more about. Unfortunately, the illustrations in this book have a rather small or low resolution font to be very helpful. And because the book covers such a broad scope, it is inevitably a rather shallow introduction to everything it discusses. Nevertheless, it's still an invaluable guide to life in England in the 19th century. I gave it 4 stars. My choice for a Jane Austen retelling was Pride and Premeditation by Tirzah Price. This is a young adult murder mystery. 17-year-old Lizzie Bennet dreams of becoming a barrister like her father. When she learns of the murder of Mr. Hurst, she quickly deduces that the man suspected of the murder, Mr. Bingley, might be innocent. She suggests to Bingley that they find the real murderer, but she is faced with opposition from Bingley's friend and lawyer, Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy. This is the first Jane Austen-inspired murder mystery I've ever read, and I was fascinated to see how the author would handle the source material in a new setting. The murder mystery was interesting enough, although if you've read Pride and Prejudice, you know that the list of usual suspects is rather short. Where this book most fell flat with me was in the Pride and Prejudice elements. There was no chemistry between Lizzie and Darcy. Over the course of the book, they meet 5 times. 6 if you count the epilogue. That means that the slow burn of the enemies gradually turning to lovers is replaced with almost insta-love. Lizzie starts to have feelings for Darcy the second time they meet. It also doesn't make sense why everyone expects Mr. Collins to propose to Lizzie when Jane is free and hasn't met Bingley yet. There are several cases where Pride and Premeditation uses direct quotes from Pride and Prejudice to a confusing result. For example, the decision to make Lizzie 17 leads to certain problems, especially since she still claims that all her younger sisters are out. If we presume that the age differences between the sisters are the same as in Pride and Prejudice, that would mean that Lydia is, 12? And even if we presume that poor Mrs. Bennet gave birth to 4 daughters in consecutive years, that would still mean that Lydia is only 14. Too young to come out to society. The author acknowledges in the author's note that the book is intentionally anachronistic. But I found myself getting increasingly annoyed with this book as I kept reading. Lizzie thinking that she could become a barrister in Regency England makes her seem incredibly naive. It would have made more sense if the book had been set 100 years later to the early 20th century. The societal expectations and limitations for women would have been closely the same, but at least it would have been possible for Lizzie to become a barrister. The first woman was called to the bar in the UK in 1922. The average teen reader might not care about the anachronisms and will probably enjoy the book more than I did. But if you want your historical fiction to be as anachronism-free as possible and want a more slow-burn romance between Darcy and Lizzie, I suggest you skip this book. I debated between 2.5 stars and 3 stars, but ended up giving this book 3 stars. It was entertaining enough. For a book by a contemporary by Jane Austen, I chose Lovers' Vows by Elizabeth Inchbald. Lovers' Vows is a 1798 play, which is a translation or an adaptation of an originally German play, Das Kind der Liebe by August von Kotzebue from 1790. As the play features heavily in Mansfield Park, it made an interesting companion to Jane Austen's novel. The plot of the play is rather conventional. A destitute woman is reunited with her long-lost son. She tells him how she was seduced and gave birth to him out of wedlock. Meanwhile, the boy's father is trying to determine whether his daughter is in love with a foppish count. As it turns out, she is secretly in love with her tutor, a priest. Because of how the play is discussed in Mansfield Park, I was probably expecting something a little more scandalous. But I can see why the Regency audience would have found the play morally questionable. Or at least would have seen an engaged amateur actress embracing another man as problematic. Lovers' Vows isn't necessarily worth the read as a play, but it does help one understand Mansfield Park better. I gave it 4 stars. I also watched 2 Mansfield Park adaptations. The 2007 TV movie and the 1983 BBC miniseries. The TV movie obviously heavily condensed the events of the book, but most of the changes made sense. The biggest problems were making Lady Bertram more perceptive than in the book and leaving Fanny in Mansfield Park rather than sending her to Portsmouth. For that reason, I actually preferred the 1983 miniseries. It's the most faithful Mansfield Park adaptation I've seen, and I wish they would make something similar in future with a bigger budget. Then it's time for my August hopefuls. In August, I plan to read fantasy and feminist nonfiction. The first is a young adult fantasy, Dark Star Burning as Falls White by Amelie Wen Xiao. This is a Chinese folklore-inspired fantasy. The second is also a young adult fantasy, this time inspired by Korean folklore, and Break the Pretty Kings by Lena Cheong. The third is adult fantasy, M.L. Wang's Blood over Bright Haven. And I also plan to read 2 feminist nonfiction books. I'm currently in the middle of Marilyn French's The War Against Women. And I want to reread Betty Friedan's classic, The Feminine Mystique. Those were the books I read in July and my goals for August. Let me know in the comments what your favorite book in July was, and I'll see you in my next video.